Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Ryan Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. In 1879, a forgotten Irish adventurer marched 4 tamed Asian elephants from the coast of East Africa to the edge of the Congo. It's a tale of ineptitude, hypocrisy, and greed, filled with powerful chiefs, ivory dealers, Catholic nuns, and dissolute colonial officials. A true story straight out of the world of Graham Greene or Joseph Conrad. Today's guest went there and retraced this journey, so it's all set against the beautifully described modern landscapes of Tanzania, the Congo, Brussels, Iraq, and India. Sophy Roberts is the author of A Training School for Elephants and The Lost Pianos of Siberia. She was editor-at-large of Condé Nast Traveler, and she also writes regularly for Financial Times Weekend, covering remote destinations from Papua New Guinea to Kamchatka. When not on the road, she hosts the excellent Gone to Timbuktu podcast. We spoke about Frederick Carter's Forgotten Journey, King Leopold II's Congo land grab, and oral memory keepers as custodians of the past. One quick note before we jump in. Many of you have written to ask how you can support Personal Landscapes. I moved the podcast to Substack and launched a new members club as a way to cover the costs of the show. I want to keep the podcast both free and ad-free, so I've come up with a set of member-only bonus materials for book lovers like you, including book reviews, bonus videos, a quarterly Q&A with me, and podcast extras, including reading lists from my guests. RyanMurdoch.com is still the place to stay up to date with my writing and travels, but I won't be posting podcast show notes there anymore. So signing up to the free tier on Substack will keep you informed of new episodes. If you'd like to support the show, you can join the Members Club for what it would cost to buy a fancy coffee once a month. I hope you'll consider it. Please go to personallandscapespodcast.com to find out more. And now, here's my conversation with Sophy Roberts. So your book tells the story of a forgotten 1879 expedition in Africa. Could you set the stage by telling us what it was?
Well, how I came across it was back in, I think it was 2015. I was working in the Northeast Democratic Republic of the Congo in an area called Garamba, which is now a national park. And there was a kind of pocket of territory that we flew into called Gangalanabodio, where we took a missionary plane. It was the only way to get in. I don't know if you've ever used those, Ryan. MAF, Missionary, Missionary Airline Fellowship. And they're the small bush planes that I've used them in Papua New Guinea before and in parts of Africa, Chad. And it is an incredible experience because these little bush planes that take you where nobody else can, apart from the missionaries. Anyway, we took this little plane in, and there was this kind of lost island of palm trees. They looked like they'd been planted by people. There were this abandoned kind of boulevard almost, like a European boulevard of these huge stones, and some buildings that were in fact being done up by the conservation agency I was with, but historical colonial style buildings. And I found it intriguing because it turned out to be the former training school for elephants, and those large stones were where the elephants were tethered with chains for parades, and the entire area was used to bring in elephants from the wild and effectively habituate them so they could be used as beasts of burden, which is not surprising to people who are familiar with the tradition with the Asian elephant, where they've been used to, rape the teak forests of Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, the same in India, etc. But in Africa, they were never used as working animals. Right back in the day, Hannibal, of course, crossing the Alps with African elephants, but they hadn't been used as working animals. And the idea went all the way back to King Leopold II of Belgium, and he needed a transport system to extract the continent's resources when he went in for his big land grab on Congo. And training African elephants was one possible solution. And I traced that story back to its origin. And I discovered a kind of really little known slither of it. Went back to 1879 when a first attempt was made. Now, 1879 was, 4 or 5 years before the Conference of Berlin, when Africa was cut up into the jigsaw that we know today. So it predated, it was like the preamble for the scramble. And I found that compelling in the chronology, I suppose, of wanting to understand what happened to that continent. And it was a really, really curious expedition. He commissioned an Irishman who is an Arabic speaker, which was essential on the East African caravan roads, which at that time were being run by Arab Swahili traders in enslaved people, in ivory and other resources. And this Irishman brought with him 4 elephants from India, so the Asian species, with a group of Indian mahouts or elephant trainers. And the idea was these Indian elephants and their experts would ride into the heart of Africa in in fact, a parade of elephants in their velvet and gold under the flag of Leopold, and teach the African elephant and people how to work with these animals. And it was kind of the arrogance and the absurdity of that I thought was curious and worthy of some more research. So that's where it all started.
So at this time, goods were moved through East Africa by vast armies of porters. A pretty inefficient process. Was that because there were no navigable rivers or no railroads? Was that why they used porters and wanted to replace them with elephants?
Well, there was no railroads until the Europeans came in and did what they did. Yeah, the navigable rivers. It's exactly like the story with Siberia, my first book was about Siberia, and I was really interested by the same notion because in Siberia the rivers run north to south, not west to east or the other way. So you can't traverse that territory, which is 11 different time zones. You can't traverse it across a line of latitude, and that's exactly the same problem in Africa across that central region. We're talking from Zanzibar, which is the island off the east coast of Tanzania, Dar es Salaam, the capital, and a trading town at the time, which was much, much bigger, called Bagamoyo, about 40 miles to the north of Dar es Salaam. And the main trading route ran from Bagamoyo across to what was then called Ujiji, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, which is right in the heart. That was the main trading line. And it then, there was lots of fanning caravan trails that ran off that, but they were brutal. They were heavily used. Some of those caravans in the 1870s numbered 3,000 men and women, not written into history, strong. Huge, huge caravans. One Frenchman in 1878, a guy called de Bays, he had a caravan of 900 porters carrying the most crazy, absurd kind of things. But it was brutal. And every year, the African grass, floods and grows and floods and grows. It's a pretty tough landscape to traverse, but it relied on porters. There was one particular culture from Western Tanzania, the ethnic group called the Wanyamwezi. They were well known for being the great kind of porters, and it was a sort of a mark of strength. They were paid for their services, but of course, it also exploited the enslaved.
Actually, I wanted to ask you about those people. They were one of the more memorable ethnic groups that you encountered along your journey. You described them as one of the great journeying cultures in East Africa. That they defined themselves by the places they ventured to, and such that a young man was looked down on at least until he made at least one journey to the coast.
Yeah, they're really interesting. It's an area of Tanzania I'd worked in before, and it's hard to work out the etymology, but they're known as the people of the moon. Why is that? It's hard to track the real core of it, but essentially they see far, far beyond their born horizon. And I found that kind of really alluring, and I really enjoyed working with the Wanyamwezi. They were They have the big storytellers, and their history is proud. They had a chief called Mirambo, who was contemporaneous with this 1879 expedition, who was extremely powerful. And I was ashamed. I'd never heard of Mirambo until I started working on this story. I was ashamed I didn't know the names of African kings and queens. And this was a way for me to engage with that because it's not taught in English schools.
Were these porters paid for the most part, or were they enslaved peoples, or a mix?
1879 paid for the most part, but it's a really complicated and charged story because Arab historians will give you one narrative, Swahili historians will give you another, African historians who don't like to concede that Africans enslaved other Africans will give you another narrative. And then on top of that, you have a whole lot of European lies, which is, did they know that they were hiring porters that were working for no fee? We only have their testimony to tell us. But we do know Stanley, for instance, said, don't pay them until you get to Tabora from the coast. Tabora is a long way in.
So to come back to elephants, you wrote that in Asia, elephants were commodified for work, and in Africa for ivory. It seems bizarre to us today, but that elephant ivory was used for making precious objects and piano keys, and even for dildos, something I learned from your book. It was so. I don't know if I dare ask, but was an ivory dildo some sort of status object?
Maybe. That's the question I didn't ask. That's why you're a better journalist than me. I didn't ask. Who would I have asked?
Well, I hesitate to ask. I don't want to know how the proud owner demonstrated this status, but maybe.
I should have asked. But what I did find was, oh my goodness! I mean, some of the images in the book, which my publishers agreed to include, there's one of an American billiard ball dealer, and that image just blows my mind. Just sitting.
It's unbelievable.
Piles of billiard balls. And I was really aware of the story of ivory and how it was being utilized and how whole towns were born of the ivory trade, including in North America because of pianos. Because my first book was about the huge demand for pianos, even in the far reaches of Siberia in exactly the same period, 1870s Russia. So I was aware of this kind of rape of the resource for effectively the leisure of Europeans and North Americans. As well as, ivory was also used by other cultures, but in Africa itself and in parts of what's now known as Democratic Republic of Congo, it was a completely different relationship with ivory and elephants. And, there's one record I came across, which was a dealer, I think it was actually a missionary, who was able to swap a tin can for a huge tusk. So it was an uneven exchange because of a different value system placed on essentially a tooth.
So was ivory hunting a thing in Asia ever?
It's a really good question. Not to this degree. And I think the African ivory is of a very different quality because one of the things they were after at this moment in time was the tusks of the female forest elephant, which exists right deep into the continent, the forest elephant, because it was deemed whiter and better to work with, to carve. But the numbers, it was the numbers that, so it's so hard, isn't it, to relate to statistics. You and I in the business have traveled to relate to people and to relate to emotion and feeling and connect those connections, if you will. And when I started out on this, the numbers were I had to try and find a way to tether myself emotionally and therefore reader to the numbers. You're talking at the start of the 19th century, that continent, Africa, had up to 26 million elephants. That number now sits at between 400 to 500,000. It's staggering. We were talking just before we pressed record on this podcast about working in South Sudan, where was just a couple of months ago, one elephant left in this region I was in, one elephant that is so lonely it's collared, which is the reason we could find it, by a conservation agency. But it's so lonely, it moves with a group of giraffe. And that, to me, is completely staggering. On top of that, this whole story allowed me to interrogate a part of the trade in enslaved people, which I had no idea about. That Arab-controlled trade, or Arab Swahili-controlled trade, you're talking between 800 and the 19th century, you're talking about over 2 million men, women, and children sold through those Swahili slave markets alone on the East Coast. The last market for enslaved people was on Zanzibar, and that only closed in 1873. So it was those kind of numbers. I wanted to try and write a story that would bring a general reader into the space to understand how profoundly significant they are. And my own ignorance was my trigger to get started, I suppose.
I think that's also why some of the photos are so effective as well, and your use of photos, because you can see the scale of like this pile of billiard balls, the ivory carving, and some of the size of some of those tusks was astonishing. Like the size of a man, a couple of them.
Astonishing, and you just wouldn't see those tusks at that size anymore. I never have, and I've gone into ivory stores on the continent on journalistic stories, and you just don't see tusks that size anymore. And there's pictures. I've got pictures of tusks laid out in the Docklands in London, and it is incredible. It's huge warehouses just laid flat with all these kind of half-moon tusks bigger than a man.
So when you talk about training elephants, the word trained kind of brings to mind obedience school for puppies or something like this, but this was a terribly brutal process. Could you give us a sense of what was involved?
It's a brutal process, and I found a film that was made in mid-century, 20th century, from that training school in Garamba. It's on the website.
I looked it up, yeah.
It's totally brutal. Tethering the wild elephant, an infant, with chasing it down with ropes, separating it from its mother, then pulling those ropes tighter and tighter, wrapping them round a tree, the mother getting distressed, often having to shoot the herd in order to take the captive infant. And then that elephant is ridden. It's tethered between two trained elephants and taken back to base where the program begins. I mean, there's lots of different techniques used in different parts of the world, but this is what they were doing up there. And then it's a case of deprivation, food, etc. It's a case of creating an environment of extreme loneliness because elephants need company. And then it's a question of creating reliance on a single mahout. And it is brutal. And there's various tools they used, which are used on sensitive parts of the body. And that is how it works. But different techniques used in different parts of the world. I don't go into that in particular detail in the book. I found it distressing, and I went for the kind of less is more, perhaps. And that was enough to horrify me. And what horrified me most of all is I've never really understood this. I've got photographs of me when I was 18 years old on an elephant in India, and I didn't know.
I had no idea about the training until I'd read this in your book, how this was done. So is this, unlike Asia, the use of elephants was a colonial enterprise in Africa. Did it stop when the Belgians left?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, there was an attempt, and a fair and honest attempt, to bring it back, because once an elephant's been habituated, it can't go back into the wild. So they still, in the 1980s, they had elephants from that training school that were never going to be rewilded. And so they tried to bring it back for elephant-backed tourism in Garamba. But it was never about retraining new elephants, and so it petered out and died on those terms. I think there was another attempt made in Botswana, but not something I kind of interrogated myself.
So I've read about Leopold's incursions into the Congo, including Stanley's expedition that you mentioned in the book, but I'd never heard of this parallel effort from the East. But we should say something about the Belgian Congo first for those listeners who don't know about it. Could you give us a sense of what was taking place in the Belgian Congo once Leopold got his hooks in?
There's a really, really important book by Adam Hochschild, called King Leopold's Ghost. I'm not sure what the American cover is. British cover, it kind of says it all. The Congolese people mutilated, murdered. The Congolese people were put through the most extraordinary period of extreme suffering in order for Leopold to get his rubber out of what was essentially not Belgian colony at first, but Leopold's private domain. It's just staggering. It's all in that book. It's staggering. And the way he got his hands on it was he hired Stanley. And that's a much better known story. Stanley, Henry Morton Stanley, Welsh-American newspaperman, explorer, made his name finding Dr. David Livingstone on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, a bit of a hero, but also controversial, slightly rejected by the British for various sort of scandals along the way. And so his ego was in a vulnerable place when King Leopold, who was full of, he was a brilliant liar, and he pulled Stanley in, and Stanley made progress up the river, the Congo River, and went further and further and deeper into the continent, signing contracts on behalf of Leopold. And then by the time 1885 Conference of Berlin comes around, it's going to be Leopold's private colony.
So before this happens, we have this parallel expedition going in from the east with the elephants, led by Frederick Carter, this Irishman that you dug up from the forgotten pages of history. Could you tell us more about him, his character, and kind of some of the struggles he encountered along the way?
Frederick Carter was interesting to me because he was so parallel to Stanley. He born in the same year, born into relative poverty, and that was Ireland in the 1840s. You've got the famine. What's the way out of the famine? If you came, his was emigrate or get a job for those who could in the rapidly expanding British Empire. And that is what Frederick Carter did. He ended up on the boats, sailing all over the world, crossing over, but I doubt very much ever meeting Stanley, places like New Orleans, etc., etc. So this parallel story was just uncanny, as it can sometimes be. He then ended up in Mesopotamia, what we now know as Iraq, and working on the Tigris and Euphrates River, running cargo up and down, up and down, up and down. And he was a brilliant linguist. And he was charismatic. He was a raconteur. He had a beautiful singing voice. He had the gift of the gab. A lot of the material I managed to drag up on his character came from other travelers who loved him and found him amusing, and in some way made a hero of him. And then when Leopold is trying to hire a man to lead this tricky expedition, he was introduced to Carter, who at that time had an injured ego because he'd been overseen for a particular consul's job in that part of the world. And an injured ego is a really powerful thing. And he said yes to this assignment, which he pretty rapidly worked out was no walk in the park. And while there were things he loved, he was a man who had a passion for hunting. He was a man of his time, but a passion for hunting. He was known for shooting Persian lions, of which there are none left, off the back of his steamer in Iraq. And when he arrived in Africa, he was shooting giraffe. There's records, a really detailed description of shooting a giraffe. And he was quick-tempered, tough, resilient, I think possibly very naive. But there were parts of him that he was like the everyman of empire. And that I found interesting, and why he was quite a good character to work with, because it's so easy to judge through the long tail of history. But when I looked at it human to human, I thought, yeah, he was like every one or so many. You had to be a real outlier. You had to be a Roger Casement you had to be a real outlier of your time. And found that really interesting, because we all think we're above judgment in our time. But what is our crime that we can't see for ourselves now? What is it? And I kind of came away from this book wondering if it is the way we treat animals. I mean, I hadn't realized what we'd done. I know about ecocide, I know about animal cruelty, but I'm not a vegetarian. Didn't understand how completely changed that landscape is because of human impact, colonial impact, as well as other factors. So it made me think, like, we just don't see the crimes of our time when we're living in them necessarily with the same clarity as the long tail of history.
He also had no experience of Africa, from what I remember, and no experience whatsoever with elephants. So his part of what they suffered was his mistreatment, his inept handling of these animals. You say that he'd never worked with animals. He overloaded them, underfed them, worked them too hard without rest.
Yeah, he had.
So just adds another layer of the cruelty.
It just adds another layer, and he had 13 Indian mahouts with him. So who was he listening to? And it was a fear of failure, I think, that led him to behave the way he did. And I think it was fear, actually. He got sicker and sicker. I mean, there's all these accounts that I kind of dug up of the fever, the African fever, whether that was sleeping sickness, tsetse, or malaria, or any other kind of disease that they didn't have a name for back then. But he went kind of crazy. He was suffering hallucinations, etc., and that craziness plays out in the course of the book.
Yeah, you really brought him to life too through your use of diaries and letters. You really feel like you know this character as you're traveling along with him. Something you said about him near the end really caught my eye. You said that as I read through Carter's letters, I could sense him adapting to his situation by doing what we're all guilty of at one time or another to different degrees. We cling to our absolutes, yet become more self-delusional in a bid to keep control when a situation is running away with us. Could you say more about that? Like, how did that play out in Carter's life? And you said us. Like, how has that tendency surfaced in your life?
So there's two sides to this question. The first, how does it play out in my life? When I set an intention, and when you're writing books, as you well know, it's a long haul, and it's a really hard haul. I don't relate to writers that find it easy. I don't find it easy, especially when you're dealing with multiple sources, when you have a journalistic responsibility to contemporary sources, etc. I find it a really long and anxious haul. But you've got to get to the end of it. And sometimes you make decisions in that process which are through thick and thin, and they might not always be right. And I'm really conscious of it. And when I saw Carter, and I could see from the outside him just sticking to his mission, he could not fail. It was that failure to acknowledge its pending catastrophe is where the hubris all boils up. See what I mean? So it's very different. I mean, I'm not mistreating elephants on a 2-year project trying to get to Lake Tanganyika. I'm just trying to write a book. But that determination can sometimes blinker you, and you become more fixed. You become more determined and less listening to all the other things that might make sense along the side. And one of the reasons, again, why I wanted to write this book is I am horrified by the lack of nuance in contemporary culture. I find it hard. Everything is black and white. There is nothing that sits in between. There is no opportunity for discussion in the way that our media is reduced to a tweet or or an Instagram post, or I believe here this and I don't believe that. But there's not so much of this kind of connective tissue, which is to do with empathy and listening to the possibilities rather than the fixities that sit between. And this book was my way of trying to explore that more nebulous territory, but I think to my moral imagination, a really important territory of the in-between space, where there's perhaps less judgment and more understanding of what is not your opinion coming in.
So is that why you feel it's so important to go to these places and to see them for yourself? Because some readers of history would be satisfied with just learning about this strange story from the pages of a book, but you felt it important enough to go there and talk to people, see the places where this played out, and see the contemporary echoes.
Yeah, there was a guy I met on Lake Tanganyika called Malilo, he was a former fisherman originally from the Congo, and he went through the first Congo War in the mid-90s when the refugees first started coming across over the lake in canoes. He took me to see this amazing piece of history that's kind of almost sinking into the lake, the Liemba, this boat that was made by the Germans, carried piece by piece during the war, and then bombed, sunk by the British, la la la. It was so interesting. He talked about witnessing the refugees escaping Zaire in 1997 after the fall of Mobutu, those fleeing the Burundian civil war in 2015. He just had seen so much history. And then we went to see the memorial in this town on Lake Tanganyika, which was remembering the moment where Henry Morgan Stanley and Dr. David Livingstone meet for the first time. That famous line, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. And he says to me, he just goes, I don't like these explorers. They come and see what we have. They take it away. We don't need to spend any time here. Okay. And I was like, yeah, that's interesting. It's really interesting. But what he did say to me, which I will never forget, is I saw this all with my own eyes. He was talking about all those wars that he'd witnessed on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. I saw with my own eyes. That is how history is understood. And I felt that was a really powerful line that made a lot of sense of what I was trying to do. I wanted to listen to witnesses. I wanted to listen to Indigenous voices. I wanted to feel, touch, smell something of this territory and this story, which is still in the oral tradition. It's still in the remembered tradition. There were people that I came across that had direct relatives that were involved in some way. That to me matters. So I weave. I'm not a historian. I don't pitch this as a historian's book. I'm a travel writer that weaves history with the contemporary in order to create some kind of reckoning between the two. So yeah, I need to, I don't know, maybe just a very kind of physical or visual person, but I need to be in place to get it. I'm always amazed by history books that bring a place to life, and then I discover the historian hasn't been to that country. I find it amazing they can do that. They've got a literary imagination I don't have.
There's something unsatisfying in that too. It's a little bit like novels where the person's never been to the place that they're writing about, and you find this out afterwards. It's this sort of, it deflates it in some way.
But don't you think when you come from a journalistic background as well, and a journalist, you are trained to be the conduit of story. You're not the story, you're a conduit of story. So I take enormous care with long interviews, and I didn't do this trip once, I did it twice, so that I could check my interviews with my sources. Not all of them, very few, had email, for instance. So it wasn't all, and I was working with interpreters, sometimes not through one language, but two, because it was a local language plus Swahili, etc. But that act of being a conduit to story is where it's connecting. It's so connecting. And people become your friends. It all comes to life. That's what I enjoy.
So you retrace that journey from Zanzibar all the way to Lake Tanganyika. staying as close as you could to the route of the original expedition. So, what were the main geographical challenges in that regard? Like, was it still fairly traceable?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite tricky. I was working with multiple sources from diaries to expedition logs to, triangulating with missionary reports, etc. So first of all, actually tracing the exact route was quite complex. The other thing is that names have changed dramatically and places have literally disappeared off the map. So that was a challenge, but that was just like hard work, plotting and replotting over that territory, because like we talked earlier on in the episode about there being a very clear caravan route from the coast to the lake, but it was also like butterflies wings, it was thousands of different threads that would change according to watercourses and all the rest of it. So bit by bit I managed to piece that together, but then retracing it, I worked with a wonderful man called Remtula Nasari, we had a vehicle. We carried pop-up tents, just as long as my body and as high as my knee that you would sleep in, that were basic mosquito nets. We used those to sleep in some forested areas, etc. There was going to be no other option. And a lot of it has been overlaid with modern caravan routes, so trains, roads, and then certain parts, nothing. And it was really interesting, actually. And I would see territory that the 1879 expedition discovered as thick forest, thick with birds and all sorts of color. And I just saw, denuded, effectively desert. So it was comparing landscapes then and now was really interesting to me. It kind of gave it some gravitas and context.
One of the things I like to in the book, in the appendix, you included a map of ethnic groups in the region. That's also something that's changed very much. It gives a really good sense of how different the boundaries were at that time, and how many different peoples were coexisting in this space, and how the territories overlapped. So even the boundaries on the map have changed enormously, along with the landscape.
And I think I'd never understood the complexity of that, and the linguistic complexity of that, the identity complexity of that. And it's all there. It's really there. And some amazing groups who were matriarchies, essentially. That surprised me. Then Wanyamwezi, we were talking about earlier, the great caravan people, they were fascinating. The Watongwe on the lake shores, who are deep animists. They live really close to trees, and the kind of sacredness of trees is so much part. I didn't get a lot of that into the book, sadly, but it is an incredible culture. And a lot of that wasn't recorded, well, for very obvious reasons, by 1879 European explorers.
Well, they're too bent on extracting resources to care about the differences between people, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
So one of the sad parallels between your journey and Carter's was the lack of elephants. He was hunting for them, and he didn't find any elephants all the way across this caravan route that he had hoped to co-opt or enslave and train. And you didn't see any elephants either until the very near the end of the journey, if I remember right, around the place where Carter's life ended.
Yeah, when I went into an area called Paradise Plains, which is a protected area, so that's why they're there. That surprised me. It surprised me because, I've worked a lot on the continent, and I've worked in, you come in on a plane and you land and you're in one of these well-protected areas, and you just think there's just a huge amount of elephant and everything's healthy and it's a beautiful kind of out of Africa romance. But as soon as you're outside of those boundaries, those effectively walls of national parks, etc., it's another story. And that there's a lot of talk about coexistence and all the rest of it, but it's not so much coexistence as it's fortress conservation increasingly. It's a really, really charged and complex topic, and people are trying to do the right thing by the elephants. I do think largely people are trying to do the right thing by the elephants. The poaching issue is way down. The conservation agenda is way up, but it's no romance.
It's pretty hard to coexist in some of these areas. I remember traveling in Namibia. I had a Land Rover and I broke it at one point. I had to go find this guy, a farmer who had Land Rover parts we could fix it together. And he told me that this herd of wild elephants migrated through his area regularly on sort of a circuit, and they would always trample one of his buildings and destroy his swimming pool. And he would just rebuild it again, and it was just a kind of a thing that happened. But he really took an interest in these elephants, and we were able to. He kind of roughly knew where they would be at the time that we were there, so we repaired my car and left it sitting, and siphoned some gas into his, and we went just searching through the bush, and we found this massive herd of elephants, and got out of the car and just stood off to the side and watched them slowly approach us through the desert. And then we would move back a little bit further, and then they would begin to approach again. We sat there for a couple of hours watching these huge animals move through their territory, but they were not concerned about human boundaries. Like they had their distinctive territory, and if there was a swimming pool or a home or something like that in the way, they would just walk through it. So having to coexist in these areas where
it's really tough.
These wild animals are living, it's not there aren't distinct boundaries.
Yeah, and that gentleman that you were with, the fact that he was just willing to rebuild is almost unusual, because in other areas there's no swimming pool, there's just one crop, and if that crop fails, they're going to go hungry. So killing the elephant is the only way to survive. And so it is so charged, this territory, and it's really difficult. I saw there was one part just near a place called Manyoni, which on one side of it was a block that they still hunt in big game hunting, sport hunting in Africa, in this bit of Africa, Tanzania. And that area was still had its wildlife for that purpose. And the local people were living on the boundary. They weren't allowed into that area, and they were regularly having problems with the crop raiding from the elephants. It's really hard. It's really hard. And this woman, she was called Edda. She was amazing. She was so moving, this woman. She was born in the 30s, she said. And she talked about her landscape back in the day, in her day, her memory. It was called the Atigi Thicket. In 1879, it was called the Fiery Plains from Congo. It was this sort of patch of vicious thorn, thorns as long as your finger, that was a real challenge for this elephant expedition to move through, because they were, the feet of men, the feet of elephants, poke your eyeballs. It was horrific. And she remembered this Atigi Thicket even from her childhood, and how you'd pass through it on the edge. But when I went, I couldn't find it. Eventually, I was shown a few kind of bushes of this thicket, but she talked about how migration of different groups, pastoralists, etc., had come in, and they cut it all down and they'd left it empty. And she said something like, they leave us with the Sahara Desert. And she was living effectively between a heavily deforested area, and then on the other side, an area that was for the elephants in this hunting block. And that thin line where they can plant their crops and tomatoes, it's a thin line. So it's tough.
I tried to find that on Google Earth after reading that section in the book, because the descriptions, those historical descriptions, are so vivid of this massive
it's gone.
Wilderness of thorns. Nothing. I couldn't find anything.
Congo. It's around a place called Congo. And that's why, to go back to that question, is like, that weave of past and present is why I do it, because it is fascinating to compare those moments in time in written records and what you see with your own eyes. But also, it's amazing how close history sits to the present in human memory. And Edda was one of those people who brought it right into the room for me. There was another fellow called Peter Sudi, who was on Zanzibar, and he was amazing. He'll stay with me for all my life. Peter, I'd gone basically to find, in a place called Mbweni, where there used to be an Anglican mission, I'd gone to find some kind of connection to the British the British-born bishop who was running the show, in the hope that his records of, he was a prodigious diarist, would tell me something about these elephants arriving in 1879. And I was in the Zanzibar archives. I found mention in his mission diary. And then he was complaining about the fact that these elephants had arrived on a day when he was ordaining the first Black East African deacon. It was in June 1879. And that was it. But he was annoyed because all the attention was on the elephants and not on this very important ordination. Anyway, so I went down to the church where I knew this deacon had been buried, expecting nothing except for maybe a paragraph of description in the book. And there was this gentleman in the churchyard hanging up his washing between the gravestones. He was an older gentleman, and I started talking to him. He was called Peter Sudi. He was born in 1934, and we talked. And then, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes into the conversation, he said, yeah, his relative, John Sweddy, was that deacon. And one of his sons had married this guy's aunt, and it was that close in history. He'd sat on his knee. He'd sat on the knee of that deacon who was there on the elephant expedition of 1879. He could describe him. He could describe his voice, his eyes, and he also gave me the history that John Sweddy, his relation, had been taken by Arabs and enslaved when he was 18, brought to Zanzibar. It was just incredible, and it became this kind of very moving. I was with two other people who were helping me, Remtula, and an Irishman who was also helping me on this bit of the job. And two of us were in tears. And it was, Peter became proof of how each life is tethered to bigger events, you know? In his case, trade in enslaved people, the power of Christian missions, the violent progress of colonialism, and he lived through the revolution in Zanzibar. And he was just like this, I don't know, this treasure of story that I would never have got if I hadn't gone to place and spent time in that churchyard, determined to try and get to the end of the journey.
Yeah, that's what I like so much about what you do, this weaving of history with stories told by living people. So you interviewed Paul Theroux this year for your excellent Gone to Timbuktu podcast. And during the conversation, he said that the sort of travel writing he did in the Great Railway Bazaar is mined out, and that we need a new sort of travel book. And he pointed to your work as an example of something new. And part of it involves burrowing into archives and all sorts of interesting places, Brussels and Zanzibar. And how do you get access to these places, and how do you find them, and how important is deep archival research to what you do?
I'm an obsessive, and it is like I talked about earlier, kind of, the dog with the bone. It's like, I'm going to get to the end. There were moments in this book where I wondered if I should just drop it, because I found it really hard. I found it really hard to be around people I didn't like, and a time that I found ugly, and a reminder of my complicity in some way, because I'm a white British woman of privilege that was in some way, Britain was built on its colonial history. But why do I go deep into those archives and look? 'Cause I kind of want to reckon with it, I suppose. And it becomes an obsession, and I keep on going. I wished in a way I could write, and I want to write a simpler book next time, because I did find it really difficult. But I don't know. I mean, you can travel in so many different ways. You can travel through a landscape. You can travel into the memories of people. But I think for me, there's so much that exists in archive, to travel into archive. I love the touch and feel of archives. In Zanzibar, there was amazing Arabic papers from 1879, and this gum Arabic used to write. There's raised writing. These beautiful pieces of paper that were almost disintegrating in your fingers. I found it so tactile and so vulnerable. There was one file I couldn't get my hands on. I tried and tried, but they wouldn't let me get my hands on it because it was so fragile. And that to me, in 10 years' time, will this story have disappeared completely because of that fragility? I mean, archives in certain places are very well looked after, but not universally. I'd find when I was going through some of these archives, including in Europe, signatures had been torn out, mostly Stanley's signature hunters. They tear out signatures. And then I find on a little card, Mirambo, the chief we talked about at the beginning, he had a British missionary living with him for a short period of time, and that missionary taught Mirambo how to write. And there's this beautiful little card with Mirambo's signature on, where he was kind of copying the letters. And I found that just you could sort of feel the scratch of his pen. It kind of comes into the room for me when I saw that in an archive in London, in fact. So I don't know, it's a tactility or a texture or an authenticity. You hear voices in archives just as you hear them in a train as you're traveling across a landscape.
So, and the other facet of your research is oral memory, and you're really great at finding the memory keepers in the places that you travel through. Those are the most memorable characters in this book. And you said that Zanzibar's president abolished the teaching of history in schools after the revolution in '64 to help heal ethnic divisions, and that this lasted into the '90s. So how did you cope with this enforced forgetting? How did you find you had to cut through the false narrative of empire builders, but you also had to cope with sort of the deliberately forgotten areas of the past among the people who lived there?
I was very lucky in that I accessed people that were super articulate on that particular subject. Ida, who is the head of Swahili Studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London. She was my sensitivity reader. Zanzibar born, amazing, set me up. I've read a lot of the work of Abdul Razak Gurna, who I'm sure many of your listeners will know, won the Nobel Prize for Literature, also Zanzibar born, left Zanzibar, revolution, etc., etc. He's written about it a lot. I think it's out there for the looking. It's not, and I've worked in Russia for 5 years, working around what one of them called page 401 on the internet, it's just not there, is sometimes what is missing tells you more about what there is. And those absences I find really fascinating, really fascinating.
So my last question. On another recent episode of your podcast, you said you can't stand the trend in modern publishing that sees a need for redemption in books that deal with tales of misery. And this came up more than once, actually. So what is it about that bothers you?
The commerce of it, to be honest. I'm a happy and optimistic person. And as we talked about earlier, I found this book was one that I kind of wanted to put down at certain points. I found it really hard, but I was not going to get to the end of it by telling a lie, by giving you some kind of slightly prettier version of Frederick Carter or giving you some kind of golden sunset that you all want because you've watched Robert Redford and Meryl Streep fall in love in the plains of the Masai Mara. I wasn't going to lie. I was already too deep in to go backwards. So I was committed. But I find in a lot of modern nonfiction, there is this, we're living in difficult times, we're living in very difficult times. And so wonder sells, a happier version of reality sells, dreamlands sell. And I come from a tradition of working for travel magazines where there isn't a lot of space for the negative. There isn't a lot of space for something that might potentially damage the touristic value of this or that place. The reason I write books is so that I can go into those spaces and not be told what I can or cannot say, which is the pursuit of a certain kind of truth. And sometimes that truth is not as redemptive as we want it to be. It's not as wonderful. Nature is not healing. Racism is still prevalent. All of those things. So I resist redemption, not in and of itself, but I resist it when it's a lie.
I love the book. It's beautifully written and illustrated, and you shed new light on a very dark period by uncovering a story that I'd never heard before. So I really hope my listeners pick it up. So thank you for your time today, Sophie.
Thanks, Ryan. And I appreciate the time you've taken to read. It's a difficult story, but I hope one that makes people in some way understand a part of the world that there is so much about it that is also, and this isn't like kind of trying to find the redemption in it, but Lake Tanganyika has spirits in every drop of water. It is an incredible and deep and special place. And moments like that made it all worthwhile. So yeah, I hope people pick up the book.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.